Morning, everyone. I work for RhED. We're a funded health service. Which is the one to click through? Okay, beautiful. And I'm here with my friend Jane Green from Vixen, the non-funded peer organisation. I don't want to get too much into what we do as a service because I really wanted to speak to the experience of sex workers just to kind of, I guess, arm you with that when you're thinking about violence prevention. So if you wanted to know anything about what we do, then I'd love to have a conversation with you. Being asked to talk about primary prevention, I'm going to not pop the mic, hopefully, of violence against sex workers felt like a somewhat challenging task, even though that's part of my role, and maybe more than a little bit depressing. So a lot of the social indicators that promote or facilitate sexual violence that Anne discussed before, the gender drivers, rigid gender roles, male entitlement, acceptance of violence as key to masculinity, structural and pay inequity, social isolation and disadvantage, and systems that don't take a strong stand against sexual violence. They're the same for sex workers as other people who are vulnerable to that kind of violence, but they're magnified and layered many times. It's tricky as a sex worker talking to people outside the industry about your job because in the civilian mind, that's our word for you, there are two types of sex worker. So there's the desperate victim and the empowered and glamorous woman. I can't think of any other line of work that we have such a calcified binary thinking about. The truth is that sex workers are university students, mums, married and single, career sex workers, survival sex workers, opportunistic workers, activists, migrants and travellers from 16 to 65. And I'm aware that mentioning underage sex work isn't uncontroversial, but I don't want to brush over that does happen. They're straight, cis and white, and many are queer and or trans. Actually, Jane just said before, some research that Vixen did in Victoria found that 70% of sex workers here were queer or trans, and many are from racialised groups. So importantly, other elements of your identity, as we've been discussing about intersectionality, you guys were discussing that, I think, specifically yesterday. Other elements of your identity affect how you're seen as a sex worker and how legitimate your choices are. So whether you are this one or this one. So people often want to know how or why you got into the industry, and that forms a part of that story. But honestly, why do you get up and go to work every morning, even if you're up until 3 a.m. binging Handmaid's Tale? We've all got bills to pay, maybe a cat or some kids to feed. Some days you get up and you're feeling motivated, you're looking forward to seeing your colleagues and your clients, you feel good about yourself and motivated to make money. You're smiling, you're on your way to work, you might have music blaring in your car stereo or on your headphones in the tram. And some days it's just a drag, Monday or Friday night blues. To be fair, there are some specific reasons why the sex industry is appealing. It's very flexible for people who are studying, working another job, have a family, or have chronic health issues. Having a job where you can choose when, where, and how you work is exactly what some people need. It's also one of the only industries where women earn more than men and have more opportunities than men. So, as I said, it's kind of hard to talk about your job with non-sex workers, partially this is because, as well as potentially receiving questions, looks, disgust, fetishizing and invasive curiosity, and a vast array of assumptions, but those stereotypes that I talked about, those figures really loom large in our minds as well. The stigma of the sex worker doesn't come just from the outside in, but it's wormed its way into our heads, and we can find ourselves thinking in those stereotypes about ourselves and each other. This is an artist's impression of my face if you were to ask me any of those questions. So stigma is dangerous for sex workers. It keeps us isolated. It's a barrier to accessing health and other services. It means that when we report, we fear not being believed, being blamed, and we have reason to even more than the average person who's going to report that kind of violence. Sex workers are often dismissed, laughed off, interrogated, or worse when we approach the institutions that are supposed to protect us. And for those reasons, as well as for the very real fear of being outed, most often sexual violence against sex workers is not reported. So I don't feel the need to go over in this room that sexual assault was underreported or the reasons why. But imagine if you were considering reporting your assault to the police, and not only did you have to consider the possibility you'd be questioned about how much you'd had to drink or what you were wearing, but that the person you were reporting to could possibly say, and this does happen, it's part of your job. If you don't like it, get out of the industry. Sorry, I've lost my place. Or worse, you could be charged with a crime. So sex work in Victoria is regulated with a licensing system, meaning that some ways of working are legal and some are illegal. The system plays out along lines of race and class. Those most vulnerable to police attention are often already marginalised, such as racialised groups, queer and trans workers, street workers, people who use drugs, and those in unlicensed brothels, which are often populated by migrant workers who may be in a precarious visa situation. Police bias against those communities means that the experiences are often doubly traumatic, and particularly in the context of drug user and migrant workers, they risk potentially criminalising themselves when going to report violence. Partial criminalisation means that not all workers have equal access to justice, and often it's the most marginalised that lose. Additionally, the full or partial criminalisation of sex workers, although purportedly for our own protection, contributes to stigma, reinforces negative stereotypes about us, and supports the idea that the work is inherently violent. Outside of a model of full decriminalisation, sex workers often have to choose between making money or working within the law, and employing safety practices or working within the law. In Victoria, the industry is regulated by Consumer Affairs Victoria, the Business Licensing Authority, WorkSafe, and Victoria Police. Barriers to reporting violations of our human and worker rights, barriers to reporting those violations of our human rights and worker rights by owners, managers, and clients to those institutions include a lack of clarity, even within and between the institutions themselves, about whose role is what. The anticipated stigma and victim blaming, the very real possibility of being outed to the community as a worker by going through an official reporting process with WorkSafe or the police, as well as the known secondary trauma of those processes in themselves. The small possibility of a satisfactory outcome to the victim survivor, and the general lack of accountability of those bodies protecting the rights of sex workers. So additionally to that lack of accountability, that's known by perpetrators, so they can act with impunity. And an example of that is Adrian Bailey, who raped several sex workers before he went on to kill Jill Marg. And relevant to, I guess, the structural kind of context of violence prevention is that as recently as 2016, the rape sentencing guidelines had a clause in them that meant that offenders could have a reduced sentence with the context of whether the victim survivor was a chaste woman. So yeah, obviously sex workers didn't meet that, and my colleague here was actually involved in having those reformed.
Actually specifically said victim is a prostitute was the name of the clause.
Victim is a prostitute was the name of the clause. Yeah, so that's as recently as 2016, so that's the kind of context that we're working in here. So I'll just say in closing that the current culture and climate, the stigma that sex workers experience means that clients feel entitled to our bodies, that society, including the services that are supposed to care for us and protect us, view us as somehow to blame or a less worthy victim of sexual violence. And anything but full decriminalisation in all areas of the industry means a choice between making a living safely and working within the law. Sex work is work, Rape is not a part of the job. It shouldn't be a crime to work in a way that protects your autonomy and safety. And if you want to know how to protect sex workers, listen to them and they'll tell you.